To start by acknowledging that I am joining you today from the unceded lands of the Palawa people in Lutruwita, Tasmania, Australia. And I also wanted to make a bit of an apology. I vastly overestimated how much I could cram into 15 minutes. So I have cut my discussion of fairy tales, hence the slightly truncated title that's on the screen. So I'm going to start by introducing you to Kamen Rider, which I'm going to assume is not going to be a familiar title to most, if any of you. Kamen Rider debuted on Japanese television in 1971, and new seasons continue to air annually today. And it's situated in a genre called tokusatsu, so that Godzilla is probably the example that most people are familiar with. But the core audience for this TV show are aged between 3 and 7, and it has a really ubiquitous presence in Japanese children's mediascapes. So even children who don't watch the show will still be familiar with it. Each season of Kamen Rider is standalone, so they don't follow one another sequentially. Each season is a full new story with a new setting and characters. But there are some commonalities. So the Kamen Rider heroes always have something in common with the monsters that they're fighting against. They're not diametrically opposed. The heroes gain their power through suffering, not through any exceptional qualities. They're not exceptionally strong or smart or brave. They just suffer a lot, and they want to prevent other people from experiencing that suffering. The program is for children, but the actors are young adults. The example I have on the screen now is one of the youngest actors, but they're usually in their 20s. And finally, all of the Kamen Rider stories revolve around what you're seeing repetitively on the screen there, which is called a henshin scene. So it's a scene of metamorphosis where the characters use a device that's sold as the tie-in toy called a henshin belt, and a series of stylized poses, and usually the spoken word henshin. He's about to say it, I think. Henshin, to transform into their superhero form. And Kamen Rider is also a melodrama in quite a traditional sense of the word. So I'm coming from a humanities background. I do apologise if this is very sort of left field for most of you, but I'm going to talk about melodrama as a genre a little bit. So to help you visualise what I mean by melodrama, I'm going to show you a short clip from the 1988 season Kamen Rider Black RX. And I'm going to use this older season for most of my examples today for reasons that I'll explain later. But I do want to emphasize that this isn't an old show that I'm talking about. It's still being made today. All right, now this will have sound, I hope. If it doesn't, someone please wave to me. Please don't be alarmed by the very convincing acting. No children were harmed in the making of that scene. So as you can see, Kamen Rider is, it's a melodrama kind of in the theatrical sense of the term. So spectacular special effects and staging, pantomime and expressive gesture, particularly during the fight scenes. And as you would expect with melodrama, we have feeling that supersedes any kind of abstract or logical approach to morality when it comes to the way that the program tackles heroism. Linda Williams asserts that all melodrama is concerned with finding a more immediate and a less cosmic justice. She writes that melodramatic heroes suffer injustice. Sometimes they overcome it by brave deeds, and sometimes they simply show their virtue by continuing to suffer. Melodrama, she continues, demands justice. So one of the most important tasks of the melodramatic hero is to suffer, and through that suffering to elicit an emotional response from their audience. And there are two elements to the suffering in Kamen Rider that I find particularly interesting. The first is that their suffering is often at its most acute, not when they are in physical pain, but when they see those around them suffering. So in other words, the audience is invited to empathise with the Kamen Rider's empathetic distress at the suffering of a third party. And keep in mind, again, this is for an audience of very young children. So that's a fairly complicated cognitive process. The second is that this suffering doesn't just motivate their metamorphosis into heroes, but that when combined with righteous anger, it can actually be the source of transformative power itself. So the Kamen Rider franchise thus consistently emphasizes empathy as the basis for the physical power that its heroes have. Linda Williams continues to argue that melodrama is actually utopian because it offers a contrast between what is and what could or should be. And the key difference that she considers to be between melodrama and tragedy is that tragedy evokes pity, but melodrama evokes a desire for action in search of change. So she claims that melodrama is justice is a fundamentally melodramatic sentiment. But I do need to go back to the toy line for a minute here. Kamen Rider is co-produced by toy company Bandai. It's what we would call a media studies toyetic television, but more commonly known as a 30-minute toy commercial style program. The narrative of each season is actually kind of planned around the toy production schedule. And the core item of tie merchandise is the transformation belt for the henshin scene that we just saw. The characters transform into the superhero costume and gain their powers through these belts. So they're not bitten by spiders or anything like that. It's just a belt, and you can go out and buy your own belt at the shops. And the prop that's used in the television program, as you might remember, it's plastic. It just looks exactly like the retail toy, but slightly larger. So there's no kind of distinction between the two. Characters will have at least one power-up, which means that they get a new belt each season, and sometimes there are multiple power-ups. And children often wear the belt toys while they're watching the television broadcast and join in with the henshin choreography, so performing those kind of stylized hand movements we saw earlier that come from kabuki theatre. Children, so the toy makers kind of responding to that tendency and encouraging it have put different features into the toys to actually encourage that to happen. So the example that's on screen, going back to that 80s series that I'm focusing on today, the toy actually had a light sensor in it that would react to a specific sequence of flashes in the television broadcast, so that when the character on TV was doing their henshin, the toy would be activated if it were held in front of the television, and it would begin to produce the same sounds and pattern of light flashes. And last year, there was another belt released that had motion sensors. So if you performed those movements while wearing the belt, it would light up and make sounds and move. So while these henshin scenes happen in every episode, there is a subcategory of the henshin scene that I would argue meets the definition of a sensation scene from melodrama. And the sensation scene, Keegan argues, sets up a distinctive dialectic between moral significance and an excess of bodily expression that's aimed at the production of affect. So the sensation scene kind of exemplifies this way that melodrama tries to achieve moral clarity through physical exaggeration, aimed at triggering an emotive response. So that's both diegetically within the story itself and in the audience who are watching the story. The henshin scenes that I would classify as sensation scenes are preceded by the utterance yurusan, which literally means unforgivable, but has the broader connotation of some sort of line being crossed that can no longer be overlooked. And the word yurusan is used in older media, including traditional literature, to signify the climax of what's called a kanzen choaku plotline, so the rewarding of good and the punishment of evil. In the context of Kamen Rider, the protagonist will experience emotional pain, often by witnessing the suffering of someone who's more vulnerable than themselves, utter the word yurusan, and then gain an additional strength, a new technique, a weapon, or an entirely new henshin belt through the kind of power of that righteous anger. And I've described this as right making might, in contradistinction to the more common, even within other superhero traditions, convention of might making right. So I'm going to show you an example of this from a continuation of the clip that I played earlier. And again, it's an older example, but the reason I particularly like this one is that the suit upgrades are actually named after the emotions that trigger their emergence. So in the clip I'm about to play, the suit that emerges is called the Prince of Sorrow, after the Kamen Rider believes that his little sister Hitomi has been killed. And the subtitles in the version I'm using, they render it as Prince of Sadness, but you get the gist. So I would like you to pay particular attention to the design of the face of this helmet, because he actually has tears coming out of his eyes.
RX 地獄へ落ちろ。
その時不思議なことが起こった。デスガロンの攻撃を受け死を覚悟した RX であったが、悲しみの涙が RX の秘められた再生能力を生き生きと発動させたのである。
何者だお前は。俺は悲しみの王子 RX ロボライダー。
君は光の戦士だ。熱くみなぎる闘志と胸には花、心に愛あふれさせ。君は輝く戦士だ。燃える瞳ひらめかせ。そんな荒野に挑め。
だからこの俺にこれほどの打撃を与えられるとは。
Okay, so I'm going to move on now from the text itself to a bit of speculation about the audience. And I apologize in advance to the many psychologists who are in the room today, because I'm going to do that thing that humanities scholars do, where we pick out bits we like from psychology papers and possibly use them entirely incorrectly. But feel free to chastise me in the question time. So, is that the right slide? I hope so. So Kamen et al. Argue that most people are bystanders rather than heroes in high-stakes situations because they're out of practice, and that imagining oneself behaving heroically in such situations might be considered a form of training or preparatory practice that could alter future behaviour. The basic idea that hero stories serve as, quote, serve as a nourishing catalyst for transformative change, end quote, is supported by a number of works by Alison, Goethals and others who may be present here today. My further contention, though, is that the combination of the melodramatic sensation scene and the tie-in toy design make Kamen Rider a particularly effective facilitator of this kind of training in very young children. So my co-author Ruth Barrett-Peacock and I have argued that Kamen Rider engages in sensation training, which is a concept we've developed by reading the melodramatic sensation scene through the lens of sensory training as defined by Elizabeth Stevens. So the repetition of the choreography matched with the role-play toys that appear in the program invites children to learn the routines and to participate physically as well as emotionally during these scenes. And we call this sensory training. This is sensory training by Stevens' definition. So Stevens argues that, quote, our sensual responses to film, just like our viewing practices, are not spontaneous or unmediated, but rather a part of the sensory training in which the technology of cinema itself instructs us, end quote. So by practicing sensory training during the sensation scenes, we argue that this becomes sensation training. So it links emotions and affects to visual, oral, haptic, and kinetic cues. So the child viewer is not only being trained in the cultivation of their senses, but in the association between sensation, empathy, and morality. One of the very few people who's done research into melodrama for children or children's responses to melodrama, David Buckingham, finds that children abstract the feelings that melodramatic texts evoke from the specific scenarios in which those feelings are presented. So children who are crying after a character's death in a melodramatic film, for example, aren't upset because of a confusion of reality and fiction, but because they're projecting that scenario and the emotions imbued in that scenario onto their own lives. So either reliving an experience of grief or imagining how they might feel to lose a loved one. The physicality of the screen depiction of emotion and the tactile experience of this through play with the same props makes Kamen Rider a particularly salient text to explore these connections between screen narratives and self. So keeping in mind that the target audience are very young children, I think it's significant that the program's tie-in toy encourages this repeated practice of imagining oneself refusing to accept or overlook an unforgivable transgression. Righteous anger isn't an emotion that adults generally seek to cultivate in young children, but the kind of anger that's represented by this utterance, yurusan, I believe is generative. It's kind of an intermediary step between feeling empathy and taking action to do something about the situation. So in my recently completed PhD, I actually looked at the adaptation of this season that I showed you footage from today into an American TV show that some of you may recall from the mid-90s called Masked Rider. It was on Fox Kids. And during the adaptation process, the melodramatic elements that I've highlighted today were stripped out of the program and it was remade into a kind of action sitcom devoid of intense emotion. And I analysed those changes from the perspective of gender, but after everything that I've been hearing in the conference so far today, I'm really curious about how these kind of transcultural exchanges could be used to inform our understanding of different cultural approaches to heroism. So in lieu of a conclusion, I'm getting to the end, I'm just going to present some further questions. So what would everyday heroism look like for a 4 or 5-year-old? And how might that be different in different cultural settings? And finally, as the kind of token humanities representative today, what can close readings of heroic stories that are presented to very young children contribute to this kind of understanding? Thank you very much.